Good morning. Happy Acceptance Day. Happy Tolerance Day. Happy Forgiveness Day. Happy Ultimate Compassionate Example Day. That's what I think of when I think of the word mother. Even if one spends the rest of one's life carrying one's parents over their shoulder throughout the rest of one's life, witnessing as they become so decrepit, so old, so frail, still, one can never truly repay one's parents. That's basically what the Buddha said. In many instances, when he was asked about the value, the presence, and the gift that is one's parents, and what or how one should relate to one's parents. Specifically today, because it's Mother's Day, and for many of us, possibly the memory is still fresh of our mothers. Or we're blessed enough to actually have them within our lives right now. Yet some of us either have not had that gift or that joy of experiencing a mother's love. So that's always been very intriguing for me, interesting as to how can we circumvent, how can we go around that and see if we can actually gain some motherly characteristics in life to kind of be brush up against and get some of that flavorings, to see some of that motherly qualities manifested in the people we meet. And the Dharma. The role of the Dharma and its motherly qualities. So those are going to be some of the themes that I'm going to share with you today. You cannot go too far when you're studying Buddhism without coming across the Metta Sutta or the Loving Kindness Sutta. In it, the Buddha has mentioned, it comes from Sutta Nipata, and it's one of the most well-known suttas in Buddhism. And it is mentioned throughout the three major traditions as well. And just briefly to mention it, the Buddha says, just as a mother would protect at the risk of her own life, the life of her only son, even so, let him spread boundless loving kindness to every corner of the world, above, below, and across, unhindered, without any obstruction, without any hatred, without any enmity. When we practice Metta Sutta, oftentimes meditators come and ask, how can I actually generate? Is it just verbally generated? Is it just, left brain type of activity where I'm just repeating these formulas, may I be well, may I be well, may I be well? And usually you can see the strain on their faces. And you can tell there's no metta, there's no loving kindness, it's just forcefulness. I always try to tell them, can you think of a moment in your life where you actually were absolutely, unconditionally, in a sense, experiencing some feeling of warmth and love? And they have to usually scratch their heads. And I say, I don't care, go back as far back as possible in your childhood. See if you can actually see a moment where you've truly, physically felt it. And within a few minutes you can see them as they close their eyes. They have this almost Buddha-like smile on their faces. so serene, so soft. For me, it's one of those moments where I actually go back, at least when I first started, and recently someone asked me about my mother. My mother passed away in '92 from ovarian cancer after like 3 or 4 years of suffering. So I saw her as her body changed. You see the person you love so much, because of whom you happen to be here, by the way. The person who actually cared for you, sleepless nights, took care of you when the fever was high, etc., etc. So I remember one time when I was a child, and it was a Saturday, and it was a sunny summer day, but it was nice and breezy, and I was still asleep, and I felt this gentle touch across my face. And as I slowly opened my eyes, I saw it was my mother. She was smiling at me. And I still remember that. It's been like over 3 decades. It's still fresh, as if it just happened, or it just is happening. Mother is not, the word mother is not a noun, it's not an adverb, it's not an adjective, it's not a pronoun, it's none of those things. If anything, it's grammatically speaking, to me, it's a verb. It's an ongoing thing. It's like love. It's an action word. It carries its weight throughout one's life. There's this principle within the Dharma, it's called Brahma Viharas, or in some ways it's translated as the divine abidings, which can carry a person through the major states of high spiritual attainments, 4 of which happen to be the jhanas. Poorly sometimes it's translated as absorptions. However, the Brahma Viharas have 3 aspects to themselves. So they're like 3 stages, one unfolds into the other. They're typically known as loving kindness or metta. The next one is karuna, which is compassion, where you do not see any more of that borderline or that silver lining between yourself, your needs, and those of someone else. You have become them. They have become you, in a sense, which carries itself to the third of the Brahma Viharas, which happens to be mudita, which is sympathetic joy. Their happiness is your happiness. You don't get the job they do, it's like you got the job. That's how wonderful it feels. And then equanimity, which is the 4th one, which is upekkha. The Buddha has said, may the meditator's mind be so that 1/4 of the mind be engulfed in metta, loving kindness, the other 1/4 be filled up with karuna, which is compassion, the 3rd quarter be filled up with mudita, which is sympathetic joy, and the 4th quarter, making a full experience, be filled up with equanimity or upekkha. When I first read this, I was just like, that's Mom. That is a mother's quality. At least when we talk about the archetypal or the symbolic phenomenon, which happens to be the ideal of a mother. Because some might argue, well, I've had a very abusive parent. I've had a very abusive mother, which unfortunately or sadly it is a fact of life nowadays. Not just here in the West, but all around the world. Sometimes we see these pockets of factual inhumanity, examples of inhumanity that is occurring. What to say about those quote-unquote mothers? And that's a heavy question to try to answer or to tackle. So mostly one would think not in terms of the physical attributes of the physical attributes of what we understand when we say a mother. Biological connection between another human being who has kept us in her womb for over 9 months. Someone with whom we are connected on such a cellular level. And that's why the connection, which I believe that the Buddha was trying to make when he was talking about metta, and to be able to look at another human being and share that love and feel that love and generate and radiate that love towards someone other than oneself, and in some cases even the enemy or someone who wishes us harm. It's heavy, it's tough, when you have someone in your life who's not intending your welfare, to say the least, or is even after your harm, like the case was with Devadatta, the Buddha's brother-in-law, who was truly after killing the Buddha, replacing him in fact, or creating a schism, separation between the Sangha members. And one single instance from the Buddha's life, his last birth, is often repeated again and again and again, where Devadatta was so shrewd, he was so cunning, he was able to convince the king to release or to give his royal elephant to him, or where at least he had some influence to intoxicate the animal with buckets of alcohol or something similar to that, in order for the elephant to be, to have lost his mind in a sense, briefly albeit, and then cause this elephant to attack the Buddha. This huge animal was charging against the Buddha, at the Buddha. Ananda, the Buddha's cousin, was courageous enough to stand in front of it and said, "Master, just, I'll take it." And the Buddha said, "Please." He generated metta so powerful, that this animal's vicious charging force was subdued to a point where, after all the dust had settled, they saw the elephant had been laying on the ground, reclining on its side, and the Buddha caressing its trunk in his lap, like a pet. The same thing was applied also towards Devadatta, where the Buddha never said anything harsh towards him. This man who arranged so many instances where he arranged for the killing of the Buddha. He had hired assassins. So how can one do that? How can one really generate love towards someone who wishes us harm? So I try to use this example while addressing the question of those individuals among us in this world today who unfortunately have not seen the complete splendor of what the term mother means. Proper mother means, the characteristics or the attributes. They are qualities, like the word tolerance, forgiveness, acceptance, love, compassion, etc. Yes, in this world, the perfect example, other than the Buddha, for most of us, is the example of a mother. Yes, we understand that. However, on a daily basis, we see these qualities manifesting. And my invitation to you would be not to be so gender specific, not to be so species specific. What I'm trying to say is, these qualities exist all around us, the motherly qualities. However, we need to develop the eyesight to see it. I've seen men demonstrating these qualities. You have two partners caring for a child. And the amazing love that pours out of their heart is truly amazing. It's truly beyond proper expression, verbal expression. However, one still owes a certain level of debt to one's parents, as one thinks about these qualities as they have been laden within us from childhood or from society. Much like we have this respect towards the elderly or towards those who are experienced or those who are our teachers, oftentimes I see in the world where people are, they come to me and say, well, it's something that needs to be earned. I'm not going to respect someone simply because they are of such an age or simply because they claim to be a mother. I feel like I can disclose something here. My father happened to be one of identical twins. Born to his parents, who have had several attempts, and several times they had identical twins. My father's aunt, she was unable to bear any children. So, unfortunately, many of my father's, elder identical twins who had been born, they died given the circumstances of the life situations. This was happening around, in the 20s or early 30s, 1930s in Aleppo, Syria, out of all places. And so my biological grandmother, my father's mother, who had given birth to him, before giving birth, she turns to her sister and says, this time around, if I do have an identical twin, I'm going to give you one of them, so that you also have a child, so you also have a son. And she's excited, obviously, because she was unable to ever conceive a child. And lo and behold, my biological grandmother gives birth to identical twins. So immediately she gives my father to her sister, my father's aunt. And because they lived together in the same area, almost like neighbors, they weren't that separate from each other. However, there was a problem. My biological grandmother was unable to actually nurse both children, both babies. Now, my father's new mother, his aunt, was really losing sleep over this, and she was in turmoil because there was no way she was able to, cater to her son's needs, the child that she finally was able to have. And then their neighbor turns around, comes to her and says, by the way, I'll take care of this. I've just given birth to my child, and I have enough within me that I can actually nurse your child. So for 6 months, this woman, this neighbor of theirs, gives her own milk, breast milk, to my father. And years pass. In fact, almost 18 years pass. And this woman moves away, and they separate, and they move to the city, etc. And my dad is 18 years old. He has a major problem with his workplace because he wants a raise and they're not giving it to him, etc. And they're being disrespectful towards him. So my father says, you know what, I quit. So he takes off from his shop. He was a barber at the time. And he was walking around in the city of Aleppo, and he's thinking, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? And he sees a bus full of people going somewhere where he doesn't even know where. He says, you know what, I'm just going to be adventurous. I'm going to just hop on in this bus and go somewhere. He gets on the bus and they drive him to this village out of town. He gets out of the bus, he's walking in the streets, he's never been to this place, to this, I guess, small city. And then he sees a commotion in the street, in an alleyway type of a thing. And he walks in. He doesn't know why, he just walks in there. And then he sees there are people coming down the stairs with a casket. They're bringing down someone who has passed away. And my dad used to be a bodybuilder at the time, so he just jumps in, doesn't ask, and he says, I got this. So he gets on top of a car, in fact looks something like a van or a small bus, and he hauls the whole thing, the casket, onto the roof of the car. No ropes, no nothing, and my dad holds on to the casket with one arm and with the, whatever he could grab top of the car. And he's like, okay, drive wherever you need to, I got this. He doesn't know where it's going. And they drive him to this area which ends up being a cemetery. And there's a priest and nobody else. The driver, the priest, and my dad. So my dad lowers the casket and tries to maneuver around it, and he places it with the undertaker or whatever into this area that was designated. And the priest comes around and, does the blessing, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, etc., and gives him a small, portion of the soil and says, now you may toss it. He tosses it, and there's a Christian ceremony where, the priest holds the small crucifix, and as it's customary, they put it on the mouth so that the person, or usually it's the son or relative of the person who's deceased, kisses it, and they put it on the forehead. It's kind of like a blessing. So my dad does that. So they drive him back to the city, he gets on the bus, he comes back, so it's a total of like 5 hours trip. He comes home and everything's back to normal. And then about a week later, he walks to his house and he sees his mom and his aunt sitting there crying. And he asks, he's startled, what happened? What happened? What happened? And they say, where were you last week? And he explains, I was in the city and then we went to this village or whatever. Like, do you know where you were? No. Were you at a funeral? Yes. Do you know whose funeral it was? No. That was Mary. Mary happened to be our neighbor 18 years ago. She's the woman who nursed you for 6 months. I've been trying my whole life trying to explain that to myself as to how the dots connected. How a mother's love. This woman was not his biological mother. My dad's own biological mother gave my dad to her sister, who loved him and cared for him, by the way. I remember her. She was in our house. She raised me, in a sense. However, this other woman who nursed my dad for 6 months, and the set of events that took place, it's almost like a Hollywood story, a novel. And my dad, last year before he passed away, he told me this story, and I recorded it for posterity. And that gives me tremendous hope in humanity, in a sense. So the qualities or traits of motherliness can come from any source. I've seen the motherly love coming from my teachers. When one of my teachers, Bhante Vimalaramsi, when he gives talks, for example, the first time I was sitting there at retreats, and it just blew me away. He wasn't saying anything outside of the Dhamma. He was just reading the suttas. And just I realized, for the first time, how the Dhamma itself is sweeter than a mother's milk. And I said that to him. because it's so true to me, and it can be true to everyone, and I've seen it in other fellow meditators, and that's why we keep doing this, right, Kusala?
That's why we do it.
There's no. Sometimes people ask us, why do you persevere? Why? Life is so harsh. Life is so mean. Life is this and life is that. But oftentimes we forget that ultimately we need to mother ourselves. Many of us have no longer our mothers, our biological mothers with us. That's okay. They've left this powerful thing in our DNA. We have the ability to mother and nurture. Mother is another synonym for nurture. You know, if you use some type of symbolism or archetypal images, you can even think of the mother being equal to, in a sense, nurturing, and the father could be for self-confidence, assertiveness, etc., etc. We can play with this. They are all interchangeable. It doesn't matter. But we need to both father and mother ourselves and our needs in a world where we often find ourselves in situations where they're uncomfortable. They challenge us. And we forget the qualities that were inherent in a motherly image, in a motherly presence in our lives. When we're unable to be feeling healthy, when life is working against us, when our bodies are becoming weaker and frail day by day, the joy and the sense of nurture that was available in our mother's hearts, we still have that. And that's what I encourage you to revisit with every single breath, if you can. To mother yourselves. Use any sources of inspiration as possible. And for us, it's the Dhamma. And how are we with time, Bhante? We're good? Still a bit.
You can talk this till 5 minutes.
Okay. I just want to make sure. Any questions so far? Yes,
I have a comment.
Please.
You forgot pet parents.
Pet parents,
Yeah, they're all over there.
Of course, and that's why I mentioned earlier. I think I mentioned it. It does not necessarily have to be species specific, because parents, it doesn't matter. Like some of the best examples, if you ever go online and check out some YouTube videos of animals being so caring and loving. I saw not too long ago a swan in a pond. She was getting the, I guess, bird feed or whatever they were giving her, and she was taking it. She wasn't even gulping it down. There were tons of koi fish around her, and she was plucking that bird feed and putting it in the water, and the koi fish were just going crazy. That's love. So many examples that you see about, for example, cows, how they take care of their calves, and when they are stolen, because that's what happens when the baby cow is taken away from her mother at birth, oftentimes. It's horrible. I mean, if we just switch, put a human face on the cow, our sentiments towards the cow changes immediately. So that tells us about our understanding of what motherhood means. It's so species specific and does not necessarily have to be so. Or I saw also, because you love cats, I know that, I saw...
Yes, I have a kindness towards the cats.
Yes, kindness. And it's a beautiful one, and it's an example that many of us can actually emulate. How a mother cat could actually be or behave towards her baby kittens, and how careful. And when I was a baby, we had a pet cat, And she would carefully lift her kittens in her mouth. So carefully. And I knew, I used to play with my cat before she was pregnant. You know, her teeth were sharp. I was like, oh, she's going to bite her. And I was like, no. She's so tender. She's so soft in her touch. So happy Tenderness Day.
And
Yes.
make one more comment.
Please.
I saw a wonderful Facebook post today.
Uh-huh.
It was about a mother,
Uh-huh.
and she says, I took a shower and kept the kids alive another day. Go me. And so all the idealism we have about how wonderful and beautiful it is to be a mother or a father, it turns out just to be 24/7 work.
Yes.
It's amazing that we even do it.
That's why it's you know, if I had a hat, I would have taken it off for mothers and those qualities of mothers. So it's not gender specific ultimately, right? It's those qualities that are so necessary for the full and wholesome upbringing of a human being or any species, right? And we all have those qualities ultimately, and that's why we practice loving kindness, for example, to generate that and to support our endeavor in this. Many of us have the privilege, or have had the privilege, of having mother figures in our lives. So all we have to do is just turn the gaze towards them and see, okay. Yes?
Hi, I have a comment. Thank you.
Please.
For your talk. And I just can't help thinking today, all during your talk, about Reverend Karuna. And I think we sit here still experiencing all she did for the temple and all the love she gave here. So she's on my mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, as I was talking with Bhante here, I looked at her in her picture and it took me back, and she was definitely, over the years that I've witnessed her and the way she would do things, her mannerisms and the motherliness in her behavior was always there. And it was, it takes me back, and you know, it hits home in a sense. And the softness of her presence. So thank you for sharing that, for reminding us of it. Are there any questions? Yes, no?
Well, did you mention earlier, unfortunately, somebody have the mother or the parents abandoned, or some often they don't have a parent, they don't have a mother. So, what do you say? How do you have to tell them what to do with when we celebrate Mother's Day, and they maybe have emotion mixing with the mothers.
As I mentioned, I mean, all we have is ourselves, and we can always go back to that as to validate what we're about to say, or our experiences basically. And I have not had a physical mother for the past 24 years. She passed away approximately 2 days prior to Mother's Day, and I had just bought her a necklace. And 2 days later she passed away. And I was very close to my mother. And every Mother's Day I'm obviously thinking of her, and it hurts obviously. It's it's a real, genuine feeling. However, I did not allow the absence of my physical mother, who took care of me, who kept me in her womb for 9 months and struggled sleepless nights to make sure I was safe, I was okay. I didn't allow her absence to diminish my own aspirations to discover motherly qualities in the world and still feel her love in the people I met, in the, let's say, women I came across, the motherly characteristics that I've seen in people and in animals. To this point, I actually one time, about 6 years ago, I went with a group of us to this elderly home. And in fact, that's where I'm going to be headed in a few minutes after the talk. I met this 92-year-old woman, Romanian, who did not have anyone visiting her. Maybe once or twice a year on her birthday and New Year's. And we became such close friends. I saw in her, because I treated her as a mother. All of a sudden there was a bond, there was a connection. I guess obviously there's been some karmic connections there, but definitely it blossomed. She's both my mother, she's both my grandmother, she's my adopted grandmother. We're not related at all. Total different life experience. She lived through basically almost two world wars. And when she opens her mouth, it's just, she has so many wrinkles, it's beautiful. I see nothing but beauty in her. And the same love that I was thinking that I was missing in the absence of my mother, it's there, available, all around us. And if it's not, the Dharma is there to actually help you generate that motherly qualities through the Brahma Viharas into the lives of other people. Simply because mother in your life possibly might be absent, that does not or need not stop us from being mothers to other people. So it's not gender specific.